Hey,
So we've got a few questions for you, and like this topic is what can we do to save the world? So love just the takeaway you have or your critique you might have on the topic, and then also
yeah,
like what specific actions maybe we can do to try to save the world out of these. Who knows?
yeah.
Awesome. So for the first item here, we have just what's happened in Quebec with Joyce Echaquet. Um, what do you think the left should be doing about this?
Yeah, I think that in general in Canada on the left, and often the left are spaces that are dominated by settlers, and among those settlers by white settlers. I think that we have a very poor understanding in kind of leftist ideology on the Canadian left. I think that there is ideology that can explain this, but we don't really practice very well what we imagine to be the solution to colonialism. And so, what I mean by that is, you've got the NDP that a lot of people see as being kind of like one of the coalescing forces on the left, I guess. And they still operate within a very colonial mind frame. I mean, they're still like respecting the fact that Canada exists and that Parliament is not useless and that kind of thing. And so, like, the fact that medical racism exists in this country, first of all, should surprise nobody. But there's a huge role that the broad left needs to play in fighting back against the kind of racism that killed Joyce and that has killed other people in Joliet and that has killed, of course, Indigenous people across Canada. And so, who are the players here? Well, we've got nurses, right? Where are the unions? What kind of anti-racism work are unions doing? And what kind of anti-racism work are they forcing management to take seriously? Or are they doing nothing? And I think in a lot of cases, unfortunately, unions, especially unions that represent people in the service sectors, so that's obviously healthcare workers, education workers, social services workers, and then of course you even have like the unions that represent prison guards and that kind of thing. And so if they're not actively finding ways to undo colonial kind of thinking, racism, oppression within the workplaces, then that's a huge problem because we can't just let this up to management. I mean, management can't even manage people to not get hurt on the job. Obviously, management can't be left alone to help to decolonize parts of Canada. And then so outside of the workplace, we have to show up to events. We have to be present for organizing. We have to support calls from family and friends. We have to support calls for reports to be implemented. We have the hundreds of recommendations from the final report into murder missing Indigenous women. We have the final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Tons of ideas, tons of thinking. I mean, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Like, there's so many recommendations that could be implemented that us as settlers, if we're involved in the left, we need to be making this stuff a priority, and we need to be figuring out the pressure points that we can target to make sure that these things actually do happen, because they're not going to happen if no one is pressuring government into doing it. And of course, Indigenous leadership, communities, activists have been fighting since the foundation of this country for these things to change, and it can't just be left to them. It has to be something that the broad left sees as being part of the core of the work that they're supposed to do.
That's amazing. I want to apologize. I'm clapping and I'm screaming and I'm cheering over here. I don't want to interrupt your audio, so I'm going to be silent. But I'm loving this. Yeah.
Cool.
So no, that's a really good point. I think that really pushes to one thing that we've heard a lot from people who are involved with unions is that they aren't as radical as they used to be. What's your take on the state of unions right now, and what can we do to improve that?
Yeah, I mean, were they more radical? Yeah, probably to some extent, but I think that we also can't get too romantic about what the history of unions have been in this country. Like, unions play a very functional legal role, and that has a conservatizing force on them. And so it's not too surprising that when you have a labor movement where a lot of the leadership were elected before a lot of you were born, or when I was a kid or whatever, it's not too surprising that they're not going to be the vanguard of action. But unions aren't supposed to necessarily be the vanguard of action either. And I think that we on the left put so much stock into leadership, and we expect like Jerry Diaz to be better than he is, right? It's like he's the president of the largest private sector union in Canada. He's not going to be running the revolution or leading the revolution. So, we have to also be very realistic about the limitations that exist within labor, while also demanding that labor do more. Because, when you look at the problems that affect people in the workplace, those are the problems that affect people in their communities and in general in this country. And so an issue like defunding the police, like, there have been some unions that have made comments, and there's certainly some unions that have done work kind of to understand anti-Black racism and how does anti-Black racism exist in specific job sites or maybe even within the union. But that's not good enough. I mean, that's the kind of thing that should have happened decades ago. And so we also need to be able to push. Rank and file members have to push their leadership. Very active progressive people have to get involved in their unions and not expect the union by a very nature of its own existence to be progressive. It's progressive when you force it to be progressive. You can't be like frustrated that this giant, very well-resourced organization is not as radical as you think it should be. And then there's also like a lot of history in Canada of like the hostility of communists and socialists within the labor movement, which is very interesting. Which is something that folks can look up later on if you're interested in that. But as a socialist, like, I think that my job is to push my union wherever I can to make it more progressive. If I have a union, of course, I'm on the executive of an organization called the Canadian Freelance Union, which is not a real union. But but we do what we can with the extremely limited resources that we have.
Amazing. I'm just going to cut all the audio with me saying these things, but
Okay.
I love all of this, by the way. It sucks doing stuff without feedback. So just know I'm here loving it.
Oh, no. My gosh, I'm so used to it. Don't worry about that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, so touching on that with like when it comes to the left putting a lot of stock in leadership, there's like various institutions and whatnot. And I guess starting in Canada, like groups like Courage and whatnot. Do you have a take on the Canadian institutions of the left?
Yeah, so a lot of the current like formation of the left, of the bureaucratic or the institutional left, it goes back to the 1990s. It goes back to being founded in an era where neoliberalism was just starting to really take its hold in Canadian politics, and the 1990s were a really turbulent time for social movement organizing. Like, it was a time where a lot of organizations that have existed for a long time actually finally collapsed. You can look at women's organizing as a really good example of that. The National Action Committee on the Status of Women, even though it didn't disappear until the 2000s, it basically stopped being the force that it was in the 1990s. But at the same time, you had people founding groups like the Council of Canadians or the CCPA or Rabble or a lot of the sustainability organizations that exist today. And so there was a renewed mobilization within that time period, and those organizations are now becoming quite, quote unquote, old. Like, it's been 30 years in a lot of cases that these organizations have existed. At the same time, you have a lot of groups that were inspired by the anti-globalization movements of the late 1990s, early 2000s. And then, of course, September 11th changed so much of that. And so we're really in a post kind of September 11th era still, even though it's been 20 years, 19 years. And I think that for young people, you've probably been like alive and active in a whole time where the institutional left has either been stagnant or has atrophied even. Like, there hasn't been that much exciting new institutionalized kinds of organizing. I mean, there's some that exist, of course, and you can look at examples of it, but it is by and large a moment in time where things are really changing. And in that change, there's groups that are struggling, hobbling along, and then new formations that are organizing. And so I think that the more exciting things are going to probably be coming in the next few years. Like, I've seen more people talking about organizing. There's a lot more reflection going on about what those new kinds of organizations could look like, and how do we learn from the past and like the point of a lot of these organizations. Why do they exist? Why do they continue to exist? What's been the problems with some of them? And how do we organize around it? And specifically what I'm thinking of is like, how has like white supremacy in a lot of these organizations rendered them less useful or even totally useless in achieving whatever their stated goal is to achieve. And then I think like you can look at the exciting organizing that is happening around 1492 Land Back Lane or Black Lives Matter, or in organizing in Wet'suwet'en and then the solidarity actions around that, or of course all of the climate activism that young people are engaged in right now. Like those are all new kinds of organizing, but very traditional, right? Very bringing lots of people together, civil disobedience, trying kind of really tried and true tactics like blockades or occupations to try and get at long-standing grievances, long-standing issues that the left has never really been able to win.
Yeah. So when it comes to winning, what can we do to help win like things like land back?
Yeah. So, I mean, like trying to decolonize Canada is obviously like a really big issue, right? So there are some very like short-term things that people can do with an encampment like land back, or with other situations that are happening, which is, you know, find out what they're calling for, right? Do what they're calling for. So there's lots of folks arrested at land back lane. Make sure that if you're in the vicinity at all, if you can actually go and bring whatever material support they're asking for. Obviously, financial support's really important, but also like it's also about being conscious and involved in the kinds of anti-colonial organizing that's happening within your community as well, because this stuff is happening all across Canada, and finding like a way to get involved without taking up too much space, without trying to become like a leader or whatever, taking your cues from folks within communities doing these kinds of actions or this kind of work is really, really, really important. And so I think for a lot of leftists who have never really necessarily thought about anti-colonial struggles or decolonization with this country, there's a lot you have to read. There's a lot you have to kind of like watch and learn. And so make sure you're following really active Indigenous activists who kind of will help explain what's going on and give you a sense as to like, maybe this is a way that I can plug in, or maybe that way, because it is also going to look different, I think, for everybody too.
Yeah, one of the things that helps build that consciousness is the media.
Yeah.
Canadian media. Do you have a take there?
No, I have nothing to say about Canadian media. They're if anybody's hoping that that media is gonna like save any of us, obviously, like don't put your hope in that. It's all pretty much garbage. Journalism is not what it used to be, right? Like journalism has changed in this country in an extremely profound way. And you know, the fact that like when I do my nightly work looking at COVID infections and deaths for a given day, the fact that I can look at newspapers from across Canada and almost all of them have the same owner. It's like, I thought media concentration was bad when I was like, I don't know, first interested in this issue when I was like 11, right? And it's gotten way worse in the intervening years between when I was 11 and today. So I think that, you know, as media atrophies and as it kind of collapses, you're going to see the worst elements of media be the ones that get saved, which means that we have to find ways to create our own media. And that's always been the case in Canada. And that's always been the case in the left. The left has always had its own ways to analyze and write and this kind of thing. What is different, though, is that it never was the case that the only place was our newspaper. Well, maybe, I mean, in the pre-World War II period, this was the case. But by and large, under like in the welfare state, liberal democracy model, where you have, you know, newspapers of record that have unbiased opinions and all this kind of thing, there would still be leftist opinions in those newspapers, right? Those days are long gone. You're not going to read anything that's going to be all that left, with obviously a couple of exceptions like Shri Prakar at the Toronto Star, but it's pretty limited when you really look at it, and certainly nothing what it's been like in years past. So yes, we have to find ways to do new things that are interesting, that push the boundaries, that do hard news, that do opinions, that do investigations, because now really is the time to do it. I've never really been so optimistic, if you could maybe believe it, of the moment that we have now to actually do things that are new and different, because there's been so many journalists that have left the mainstream who are pros, who know exactly how to do it and who can kind of teach other people and bringing people along, who are actually starting in new and alternative formats, which I think is what we really need right now. So, but I mean, it's not going to come back in the format that it was before. And there's a lot more that I could say about media. It's obviously something I think about pretty much all the time.
Is there anyone that you could give a shout out to? Like, where do you go for your media?
You didn't listen to our latest Sandy and Nora episode because I
Ah,
actually answered that question.
ooh.
Um, yeah, I don't think that the question should be where do I go for my media? Because I mean, I read everything. I don't care if I have to read Le Journal de Québec, which is like our more right wing daily newspaper that's owned by Québecor. Uh, Oftentimes actually their coverage is the best for local stuff, for somewhere between them and Le Soleil, my local newspapers. So I would say to people, like, what you have to do is develop a critical eye so that when you're reading something, whether it's the Globe Mail or it's the National Post or it's the Edmonton Journal, you can spot the bias. It's not necessarily that you have to seek out progressive writers, that you actually can spot the bias yourself, and then you can do that kind of analysis. Because I have to admit that there's not any writers whose work I'm constantly looking out for. And that's also just because we don't read newspapers the way that we used to. I mean, I used to go to the torontostar.com once an hour to see what's changed on their homepage. I mean, no one reads newspapers like that. I certainly don't anymore. And so it's not like I'm always searching for the column of a particular individual, because I'm seeing it more often than not on Twitter, right? So that's it definitely changes how you interact. And but there's good leftist analysis. I mean, a little bit in Canada. There's not enough. But there's some of us out here, and you just have to develop what you are most kind of turned on by or interested in, based on what your preferences are.
That's awesome. So I guess the next item then is, so if media is one component to kind of building your awareness, another thing a lot of people look to is like international movements and international structures. I think we see a lot of people talking about Bernie Sanders was kind of brought them aware to a lot of the issues that the left struggles with.
Yeah.
Is there any international institutions right now that you find inspiring, or like, for example, Progressive International is a new one. Not a lot of people know much about it. Is there anything you're inspired by?
Gotta be honest with you, nope. No, you know what, I love that people have enough like of brain width to be able to watch what's going on in other countries. I'm really, really focused on Canada, and I have to admit that I'm not paying too close attention to what's going on in other places around the world, which is a criticism really of my own, what I consume, probably because COVID has been so kind of consuming to me. Like, the big question I have right now is like, how has Vietnam managed to manage this pandemic in the way that they have? I'm very interested in that, because Vietnam seems to be like just really managing this pandemic in this incredible way, if you look internationally. But I think that what we need to look at, and a lot of English-speaking Canadians, they will talk about things like momentum in the UK, or you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and look at it more with an eye to how do we do that here. And I don't look at their campaigns like that. I don't look at AOC and think, oh, whose candidate is AOC? I look at AOC and think like, this is a wonderful example of why authenticity in politics and being someone who likes to shake, say in French, shake the cage of the establishment, is so important, because that is where you get really exciting and activist movements that start. And in Canada, like, we're kind of like, I'm not sure what our collective problem is, but like, we seem to be really allergic on the left to seeking people out who are charismatic. I don't know. And so because of that, like, we think that there might be like a silver bullet in this kind of individual because maybe they're well known or whatever, right? And you saw a little bit of that with like people trying to recruit Avi Lewis to run for the NDP, right? It's like, this is going to save the problems. It's like, no single individual is going to save the problems of the NDP. It's going to take a lot of boring mobilizing and organizing. And there are exciting candidates and there are exciting politicians who've come like into the spotlight in the last couple of years. But there's always something behind that. There's always a movement that's more interesting that's coming behind that. And so even though I started off by saying I'm not totally inspired by some, I guess, movements around the world, I do have to say that I find the resistance in the United States right now that Black Lives Matter activists, people like broadly organized under the Black Lives Matter movement banner, is probably the most exciting because the stakes there feel really, really high and really desperate. And we all know that regardless of what happens in November, that kind of organizing, that kind of mutual aid is going to be the only thing that saves folks in that country. And so I think that is very inspiring. And there's elements of that happening in Canada too.
Awesome. We're coming down to the end time here. So to be appreciative of that, I think we're going to skip NDP and some of the political parties and let's just look specifically at mutual aid. Is there anything specifically you would like to see be popping up in Canada in the short term?
Well, I think that we have to be better at providing services for ourselves, which is always in conflict with our desire to save public services, right? So when we try to help things out for each other, there's usually it's because there's a lack, and so there's always a tension between people who want us to demand that the government provide that lack or whatever that's missing, and then us doing it ourselves. And I'm very interested in that tension. I think that's a really healthy and important tension for leftists to think through and to analyze. But when I was a couple of years ago, after Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, I had the chance to go down and do relief work with them. And the relief work that I did was mobilized through Occupy, which was interesting. And it was like the first time that I really felt that mutual aid and auto organization, or I would say in French, right, auto organisation, was like really going to probably be the thing that saved incompetent, corrupt government leadership and government failures. Because it was really like we showed up and through Occupy we're given everything that we needed. We were dispatched to people's houses and we did relief work while FEMA was like not present and all of these other kind of public services were failing. And so I learned a lot. I think that, as climate change is going to completely uproot so many people's lives, the need for us to be able to offer services to one another is going to increase. And while I think we still obviously need to push on the federal government and on provincial governments to fund public services and to do that kind of work, I do think that it is very exciting and interesting to start imagining our communities in a way where we're like we provide local food to ourselves? Can we have neighborhoods that feed one another? Do we know each other anymore? Right? We probably don't, because we are building community that has been so decimated by neoliberalism. Right? We're talking about 4 decades of neoliberal economic policy that sought to completely destroy our sense of community, and by and large it has, right? And so this is where like unions have a really important role, where they should be doing a lot of community outreach and making themselves vital like hubs within their communities to help improve the lives of people, of course, their membership, but also the people who aren't in their membership, because they have the resources to do that. And then through creating these structures, we actually can then show the state, look, there's a great example of a health clinic in my town that helps mostly low income and no income people, and they had to privately fundraise for it. But eventually the government was like, oh yeah, okay, this is obviously working, and so it became a publicly funded clinic, right? So there's really good reasons for why we need to organize like this, and oftentimes we're stymied by the feeling that government can't change anything. We can't force the government to do anything. Government's too corrupt, they're too slow. And at the end of the day, then we need to be doing these things then for ourselves. And we can do some of the stuff for ourselves for sure. And we need to be doing more.
I think maybe you just said it, but is there any specific final thought you might have on the one thing we should focus on doing to save the world?
Yeah. What would be the one thing? I think that the real one thing is to take a look at your own life and to see how you can orient everything in your life do better, to do better for your friends, to do better at work in terms of like making it better for the people around you. And when you start to do that kind of work, you find other people who are interested in similar kinds of change. And that's how you start to build networks that are outside of cliques or outside of social kind of situations. Find people who you might not have ever worked with before on a certain issue, and be there when the time comes that you need to be present, and you need to be the one to say, yes, I'll find the sound system. Yes, I'll find the food. Yes, I'll do this. Because, everyone's busy and everyone's at their limit, but we always get busier, and you can always, push yourself a little bit further. And I think that we have to. I think we have now, especially, is the time that we have to, in real life. I mean, the online organizing, there's benefits to it, but there's also a lot of drawbacks. But in real life, like, we need to be building those kinds of community-based structures for us to make other people's lives better, because there's a whole bunch of really important reasons for why. But I think for me, what is really interesting about doing that is then you learn actually what are the real issues that are stopping people from whatever it is that whatever the problem might be, and then you come up with new solutions that you may have not thought of before, they may have not thought of before, or you together would not have thought before, because you've never talked together to push something forward. So be bold, and don't make excuses for why it's impossible. Find a way to do it.
That is absolutely beautiful. Oh my God. I think we may have set the bar too high. You should not be first.
Sorry.
Well, I wish our other contestants luck. And thank you so very much for this, Nora. This was absolutely incredible.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thanks.